Okay, so I'm here with poet Brian Yapko, and Brian is the winner of the 2023 International Poetry Competition sponsored by the Society of Classical Poets. So I'm very excited to be talking to him. Brian, how you doing today?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm very excited to be here also to talk with you.
Great, I'm glad to hear it. How have things been going for you since you won the competition?
Well, I'm still glowing. I was very excited to get that win. I didn't honestly expect it, but I'm incredibly grateful for it. And it does make me feel validated. I've worked really hard on my poetry, and it makes me feel really good to know that I've written things that people respond to, in particular, the winning poem, Farinelli.
Yes, it's a well-deserved win. I'm given to understand you've recently retired to Florida. Is that right?
That's right. My partner and I moved to Florida November 14th, so we just celebrated 3 months and 2 weeks here. I am loving it here. We came from New Mexico, from Santa Fe, New Mexico. I looked at the weather there yesterday just for kicks, and it was 25 degrees with a 16-degree wind chill.
Mm-hmm.
So today in Florida, it's going to be 84. I went for a swim this morning, and the difference in lifestyle is just amazing. So I'm here with no regrets.
Great. Yeah, my parents retired to New Mexico. It's a nice state. It has its benefits and its drawbacks.
Yeah, I love New Mexico. We were there for a little over 5 years, but it was like a chapter in a book. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I just couldn't see spending the rest of my life there. And then there were the politics also.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Right.
want to get into a political discussion here, but I find the politics in Florida a lot more congenial than I did in New Mexico.
Well, it's good. It sounds like a better fit. Now, professionally, you're coming from the law. Is that right? You're a lawyer?
Yes, I have been a lawyer since 1987. For a while, I was admitted in 3 states. I was admitted in California, Oregon, and New Mexico. When I started thinking about retirement, I resigned from the Oregon bar. I went inactive in California, and I just went inactive in New Mexico 1 month ago. So I am still a lawyer in California and New Mexico technically, but I'm inactive, so that means I can't practice anymore. I really enjoy having the leisure time to be able to write and do the things that I want to do.
I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of your work appearing as well because of that. That's nice. Could I ask what your specialty was in the law? Like, what did you do? Like, were you a trial lawyer?
I did litigation, which includes trial work, but not limited to trial work,
Okay.
from 1987 till 2012, primarily litigation. And then when we moved to Oregon, I segued into doing primarily estate planning. And I liked estate planning a lot better than litigation because people weren't constantly screaming at you, and I wasn't up at 3 in the morning having arguments in my head with the judge. And it was a lot less full of conflict, and I really liked that.
Do you feel like your profession has influenced your poetic style at all? Is there a connection there, or are they totally unrelated?
Oh, they're really closely related. It was actually a downer for me to go into law in the first place. I wanted to be a writer. I had gone to UCLA. I'd graduated with a degree in English Lit. I either wanted to go into the entertainment industry or to just become, an academic. The old parental pressure, why don't you become a lawyer? And that way you'll make a living. So I finally did succumb to parental pressure and student loans and all that. And I went to law school. And at first I hated it because it beat all of the creativity out of me. When I was writing for English, it was fun. It was creative. You got to be flowery. You got to use exotic words. And when you're in law, that is actually a hindrance rather than help. So they want a really spare style, just the facts, unemotional language, very logical. So I spent 35 years of basically writing that way. And that absolutely influenced my style. It gave me a sort of impatience with flowery language. It made my poetry very linear. So one of the great compliments that I get when people say, "Oh, I loved your poem," and it's like one of the few poems that I was able to actually understand. And then the other thing was, as a litigator, I had to write up documents for clients, basically for them to sign, their sworn statements, that sort of thing. That meant I had to actually write in their name and in the first person narrative. And that gave me some hands-on experience doing first person narrative writing. And that's one of the things that I think has greatly influenced my dramatic monologues.
It's interesting that you say that. I also interviewed Adam Seedy, who's a poet and a lawyer by profession, and he said something fairly similar, not as rigorously intertwined as you were.
As a litigator, I've seen so much life happen. everything from divorces to child custody cases to murder trials to suing doctors and just seeing people at their most emotional. And it's really hard to have that sort of parade of humanity, in front of you and not be influenced by that.
So, would you say you've always considered yourself a writer by vocation? You got kind of sidetracked then, and now you're back to your true calling.
I would say exactly that. This is what I always wanted to do. I knew for a few years before retiring and before getting into poetry that I wanted to write. And I thought that my best destiny was science fiction.
Mhm.
So I started outlining and detail writing a science fiction trilogy. And I've been working on that for a number of years. And I haven't put that aside. I'm still working on it. But poetry is more satisfying to me. Whatever creative writing I do, I tend to probably apportion it like 80% poetry, 20% narrative writing.
You sometimes encounter people who, like they wanted to be writers, but they got sidetracked. They did the practical thing, but then, of course, you've avoided the starving artist lifestyle that people who do pursue that vocation have to live.
It's hard to second guess God.
There you
I
go.
do believe that we all have a destiny. I believe that we're sort of like, guided into it. Whether we like it or not, we can either do it kicking and screaming or we can do it in a more like serene way. But I think what's meant to happen is pretty much what's going to happen.
I'm also of that opinion, so agree wholeheartedly. Aside from your professional influences on poetry, what about some of your poetic influences? You mentioned, first-person dramatic monologues. You have any poets who have influenced you in that regard?
Oh gosh, Robert Browning is probably far and away the most influential poet. He's not the only poet. I love dramatic monologues. That's not the only thing that I'm interested in. The writer who might have been the biggest influence on me really would probably be Shakespeare.
Hmm.
Because I took a Shakespeare course at UCLA. I made a point of reading everything written by Shakespeare during the period of time between graduating from UCLA for undergrad and starting law school. I love Shakespeare, but not the poetry as much as the plays. That has been a huge influence on me because he did monologues in the plays.
Hmm.
And they're not poetic, dramatic monologues like Browning does, but they are nevertheless very theatrical, very dramatic, and very poetic. I should also mention, when I was in high school, I won a prize for Shakespeare cutting. I played Falstaff in a cutting of Henry IV, Part 1, and
Hmm.
we won like the first prize in all of Southern California. I thought I was going to end up going into the entertainment industry. I thought I was going to end up being an actor or something like that. I like to have characters who are in dramatic situations. I like to write those dramatic situations. I like to get into their head. I had a fellow poet ask me, so I don't understand, how can you write poetry in woman's voice? Because I've written several poems in women's voices, St. Therese, Cordelia. And I said, well, it's because at one point in my life, I wanted to be a playwright. So guess what? Playwrights don't just write male characters. They write female characters. They write all of the characters. I don't think there's anything that unusual about that.
Definitely. I think it's a completely false stereotype that, men write only men and women write only women. And I think it's really hurt the publishing industry because they just want people to write books from the perspectives of their own social background. And it's just incredibly limited because the greatest authors never did that at all. But it definitely shows your skill that you can write in a variety of voices. As far as those some of those classic works, Shakespeare, Browning, do you have any selections of their work that you'd like to read here?
Oh, I didn't even think about Shakespeare. I do have
Okay.
Browning. I have My Last Duchess, if you want
Ah,
to read
yes.
that
Yes,
myself.
one of his greats.
Okay, I will go for it. My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder, now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will't please you sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one. My favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-year-old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss, or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. Will please you rise? We'll meet the company below. Then, I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Oh, notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me.
A great poem, a masterwork. Now,
Yeah.
historically, I'm trying to think. He was a duke.
The Duke of Ferrara or someplace in I think, 16th century Italy.
I think that the same duke was actually the patron of Torquato Tasso, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, of the D'Este family.
Fun period. Browning was fascinated by that period, too.
It's very subtle, but he killed his wife, right? He probably killed her.
It's not explicit, but he says that one line, this grew and then I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together.
Yes.
So the question is, what does I gave commands actually mean? Yeah, I think he had her poisoned or something.
All right.
And he's just such a selfish, unaware of his selfishness kind of character that I find him really fascinating. And this is the kind of thing that really inspired my own poetry, because I loved the idea of characters describing themselves or describing situations in their life and not being, completely honest or even completely self-aware.
I think it's effective when there's kind of like a narcissistic tendency there, or a very self-absorbed tendency, like you say, the lack of self-awareness. And
I did a poem on that a couple of years ago. It was Salieri on Mozart, a riff on Amadeus, but it was a lot of fun because he was just so jealous and unself-aware and kind of drunk, and the things that he said about Mozart. It's fun to write in character.
You've got a lot of great pieces I've read. During this past year, you seem to have been especially prolific. How many poems have you written?
You mean total in my whole life?
Published poems.
I've been published a lot, considering that I've only been doing this for like 3.5 years. I started out writing probably 60% contemporary poetry and with maybe 40% classical poetry.
More free verse stuff?
Oh, a lot of free verse stuff.
Yeah.
I don't respect it in the same way. As the years have gone by, I've contributed less and less to other publications and more to the Society of Classical Poets. I've written hundreds of poems. I submit 5 poems a month to Evan. Something like, 60 poems a year.
That is quite a bit. I think we joined up with the SCP right around the same time during the pandemic. I'm kind of the same way, where I don't really submit to very many other places either. SCP is just kind of where it's at in the 21st century. Yeah. Not to discourage people who want to do that. It's also much more likely people will see the poems on the SCP as opposed to other journals that are more obscure. Most of these journals are only read by the people who submit to those journals.
I mean, most of those journals too. I mean, I think there's a big difference in reward of excellence. Because I think the Society of Classical Poets, I mean, they really try to get you to work hard at craft, at rhyme, at meter, at the use of figures of speech, all of the bells and whistles, the assonance, the alliteration. And my experience with publications that deal with contemporary poetry, they're much more navel-gazing. They're much more willing to reward DEI stuff, social justice things that, frankly, I have very little sympathy for at this point. Slowly, I came over to the Society of Classical Poets. I've encountered so many brilliant poets on this site. I've learned so much about different points of view, and it's really changed me. And I can't think of another poetry site that can do that.
Yeah, I think Evan Mantic has a vision that other editors lack. My own experience dovetails with yours. I got much better very quickly because of the educational function of the site that, again, other journals don't really have. They're much more closed. They don't really have like open discussions in the threads or anything like that. And here we are talking to one another. We never would have done that if it were for the SCP.
Very
But
grateful for the experience.
what were we talking about? We're talking about Browning before. We're talking about your own dramatic monologue style. Are you consciously trying to build on Browning in any way, or Shakespeare, in terms of particular stylistic details?
I would not presume. I would never come close to being the great talents that they were. They've inspired me, but they've inspired me to do the best I can do Yapko, and that's it.
If I were to ask you to boil down some principles for dramatic monologue writing, could you do that? Like, how do you go about studying the psychology of your subject, for one?
I have to put the spotlight on the character and get out of the way. So that's one of the things that I would say I absolutely do. I treat it like I'm writing a play, where I really want to be true to the character. I don't want to inject things into the dramatic monologue that don't belong there. I can explain that in musical theater terms. The musical West Side Story. Stephen Sondheim is the lyricist, and he's a very young lyricist. And he writes a lyric for Maria called I Feel Pretty. And he has her saying, I feel pretty and witty and yeah, and pity any girl who wasn't me today. And Oscar Hammerstein, who was his mentor, came to see a rehearsal of West Side Story, and Sondheim was expecting Hammerstein to, fall all over him with praise. And Hammerstein goes to Sondheim and says, "There's that lyric, I feel pretty." And Sondheim goes, "Yeah." Hammerstein explains this girl who is a new immigrant to the United States who does not speak English very well is not going to say all of these incredible articulate things that have internal rhyme and this vocabulary. She would not be unwelcome in Noel Coward's living room. That was untrue to the character. And Sondheim was embarrassed by that lyric ever after. And that's a lesson that I sort of took to heart, because it means that a character that I write has his or her own vocabulary, his or her own way of speaking. He has his or her own limitations. And these are things that I have to be really true to. That manifests in terms of what words I actually use. For example, I did a dramatic monologue in the voice of Elagabalus, the emperor, transgender emperor. He's going to be very articulate. I have him speaking in heroic couplets. That brings in the sort of Latin aspect to it. A very different structure and very different voice than another poem I wrote, which was called Lullaby of New Mexico. And that was a dramatic monologue by a sort of older, uneducated Mexican man who was driving his child to a child custody hearing. And so I wrote that with a certain amount of longing, but with a limited vocabulary peppered with some Spanish. And it was in blank verse rather than in couplets or in anything that rhymed. That's kind of the difference. Each one was right for that particular character.
Do you have an example that you would like to read from among your own work? I think we should start with your award-winning poem for which you got first place this year.
Okay, sure. Farinelli.
Mm-hmm.
1,000 thanks, Martini, for your visit. Bologna is a town of balladeers. You'll love it. Now I wonder, how long is it since we both quit Madrid? 20 years since I last sang before the King of Spain, and 40 since vast crowds hailed me on stage. May Farinelli's music always reign. It seems so long ago, a different age. Such memories inflict more aching than my unfused joints. My brother is to blame. Ricardo was an honorable man, yet traded my virility for fame and sterile wealth. My canny, long-dead brother, who chose for me this well-paid, grotesque life. Am I too candid? How can I be other? Resentment sometimes stabs me like a knife. Come sit beside the fire, the heat, the flash, the crackling sounds your music. Watch the flame transform once living branches into ash. Ricardo thought with flesh it was the same. My body could be artfully adjusted, so my soprano voice would stay unchanged. He met a doctor whom musicians trusted. To thwart my puberty was then arranged. The doctor said he needed one small lie to justify this drastic operation. Pretend a fall had knocked my groin around, so he might plausibly suggest castration. He found a clamp. He donned his spectacles. He gave me opium. He placed a pan between my legs, then crushed my testicles. I screamed, deformed to something less than man. But crowds adored my singing. Heaven sent, they cheered in Venice, Barcelona, Munich. The great castrato, Europe's main event, the opera world's most celebrated eunuch. No wonder music soon became my life, for there was nothing else that I could do. Quite celibate, I dared not take a wife. The parts that make men virile never grew. I will say this, I like my fame and wealth, despite the flaws within my brother's schemes. Although I've neither progeny nor health, my great success surpassed his wildest dreams. In secret, though, I ponder, might my voice not still be splendid as a baritone? I'll never know. He took away my choice, and like my life, my death shall be alone.
It's a powerful poem, a powerful ending especially. There's a number of things I like. The metaphor of the fire and the flame, and just some phrases like you could have used empty wealth, but sterile wealth is a very good choice of diction. I write for the Epic Times. I write classical music articles is the thing that I've been doing recently. And I submitted an article on Farinelli, and I actually plugged your poem in that. So I had a little section about Farinelli and art because a lot of artists have tried to capture his mystique. There's this kind of fascinating quality about him, because he retired so young, at the height of his powers. So yeah, I plugged your poem. I'll send you that when it comes out.
Yeah,
But,
thank you. I didn't just write this poem to write this poem. I mean, I wrote the poem to make a point.
Yeah, it's not hard to draw the parallels with what's happening today in our own society. But I like how it's all kind of under the surface. You never devolve into just making explicit contemporary social commentary. You stick to the subject matter too and let people draw their own parallels.
That's actually one of the things, again, that I learned from my law experience. You could have a lawyer standing in front of people arguing and arguing and arguing, and nobody cared. But then if you had a witness in the witness box who was explaining what happened to her, that made all the difference in the world. Then you'd see the jury like this, just rapt. So I learned that first-person narratives touch people generally more than third-person narratives.
Let's see, was there another poem of yours that you would like to read? It doesn't have to be a dramatic monologue, it could be anything.
The favorite poem that I have ever written is My Brother in Galilee. It is a dramatic monologue. It's in the voice of the Apostle John. And I loved writing this poem. I've never failed to be moved by it, even though it's my own work, anytime I've reread it. So that's one that I'd love to be able to share.
Okay, let's go for it.
Okay. My Brother in Galilee. I had a fearsome dream. I saw my friend, my teacher brother, nailed onto a cross. I wept with sorrow at my brother's feet. He said his mother henceforth would be mine. Unearthly lightning blazed across the land. I gasped and woke, my blanket cold with sweat. What does it mean? I do not understand. Perhaps it's nothing. It was just a dream. It's morning now. The sun is bright. He's fine. I fondly watch my friend, my teacher brother, give thanks, eat breakfast, then stare at the clouds. He bids me sit. He smiles the hope I seek. He offers me warm bread. We rise and pray before the crowds return to hear him speak. I love to hear him laugh. His cup is full. His eyes bear wisdom, honor, steadfast peace. He quotes the scriptures freely. Then he grins to watch the antics of the hoopoe bird. He's fond of wine and fish fresh from the net. He beams at children, does not suffer fools. He's more alive than any man I've met. I think of what he did at last week's wedding, where he was welcomed as a kinsman's guest. His miracle of water turned to wine was unforgettable, beyond my ken. But I will long recall one other thing, how first he was aloof, but by night's end danced with the joy that only faith can bring. He sometimes takes my hand. I see strange things, the future through a glass as dark as night. Sharp thorns are in his hair, scars in his palms. I close my eyes to shake this vision off. He sees my pain. A psalm, he says. Let's raise our voices up and offer humble thanks. My Father's works are worthy of our praise. Last week he bid me join him up the hill. From there we watched men fishing on the lake. He touched my arm and said, "You must have faith." The time will come when we shall never part. His voice grew soft as he gazed at a tree. He seemed to brood. His words seemed sad and strange. My tree shall lead you to eternity. I could not halt my tears. What is to come? He has so much to teach and love to give. These quiet, private moments which we share are things I think he wants me to recall. He says that soon he'll go where I can't follow. And though I grieve, our Father understands and values tears more than a heart that's hollow.
A great poem. In the popular culture, you never really encounter religious poetry anymore. So thank you for that. I especially like the detail of Jesus' dancing for joy. He's usually a solemn figure.
It's funny because I think of Jesus as very human. I know a lot of people think of him, more divine than human, but I kind of think of him both ways. I can imagine being friends with this man and being just devastated and, the tears when everything goes south. I wanted to describe having a relationship, not God in a far distant cloud hovering somewhere and looking over me and judging me. I wanted to have a Christ, my friend, taking my hand and telling me things are going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. I like how you start with "had a fearsome dream," how you frame it that way. It makes it very effective.
Thank you.
But you putting out a publication anytime soon, or are you planning on that?
It has been suggested to me that it would be a good idea. I actually haven't taken any concrete steps towards doing that. I think I will start doing that. I think I'll do a collection of dramatic monologues. And I might do something like what Susan Bryant did, a book also on some of her social observations. I've written a few snarky things as well, And then I am working on a very lengthy piece on St. Augustine, or Augustine, depending on how you like to pronounce it. I'm not doing him as a dramatic monologue because he did his own dramatic monologue in his Confessions. So I am doing portraits of him through the people who knew him, including his mother. There's a poem coming out in a couple of weeks on the SCP called Monica's Consolation. His mother was St. Monica, and I did a dramatic monologue in her voice. And that's just one other like principle I think I should mention as far as dramatic monologues and writing poetry. This I also got from musical theater. Oscar Hammerstein specifically, one of his major rules of thumb was they never tried to make a musical out of something unless they felt they could make it better. I kind of feel that way about poetry, is I don't want to write a poem about something if it's already well written and there's really nothing I can contribute to it. That's one of my guiding principles. But if there's an idea that I can find a fresh take on something, I will gladly write a poem on it. I did a poem on Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac a few months ago. Obviously, I can't really improve on the biblical narrative, but I did feel that I could show some of his thinking, what might have gone into his thinking in that.
Right. Movie remakes are the same thing. They think that they can do it better, and usually they can't, but occasionally you get something that's like a fresh take. And especially if it's a very famous subject that has been treated a lot of times, since antiquity. You're going to have a lot of retellings of that story, like Joan of Arc or something. How many people have done a take on that? And there's so many angles you can go with that. But, I'm excited to hear that you're putting together a collection, and if you did any advice about that or little tidbits. Classical poetry, it's highbrow stuff, boutique art stuff, and the mainstream publishers just aren't interested in it. I had a friend who, when he submitted his work, he actually tried to go for mainstream publishers. He submitted to, 60 places or something, and he got rejected from all of them, of course. If it rhymes, they're not interested in it at all. You have the small publishing houses that are willing to go for it.
Well, and the politics, unfortunately, also, I think at this point I would have a difficult time finding a publisher, if I didn't self-publish.
Again, it's a learning curve. You have to do every aspect of it, right? There's the formatting and the cover design and everything. But with the online tools that they have now, I use Canva Pro for stuff, and it's a lot easier than obviously it ever was in the past. So that is a plus. You have to do it yourself. But it's easy to learn, and your tools are really high tech.
Well, we have something to talk about then.
Definitely. Do you have any advice for the younger rising poets at all?
I have found in my experience, I am best at what I love. If I love poetry, it means I'm going to keep working on poetry and I'm going to keep trying to get better and better at it. If I love certain types of poetry, then that's probably the type of poetry that I'm going to learn the most from and enjoy the most writing. And I would say choose subject matter that interests you. Choose the type of poetry that interests you. Classical poetry especially can be a very, very intimidating, highly educated type of artistic endeavor. And it needs to be to some degree. It's a form of high art and it needs to be done in an educated way, but it also needs to be fun. And I would say don't ever lose that sense of fun and play that comes with it.
Mm.
I know poets who just have a blast, playing with words, and I think they're the happiest poets that I've met.
Yeah, that's good advice. Follow your heart. It's very basic, but it's something that not a lot of people do. I read an article in Forbes just the other day. The journalist interviewed 4 different people in the publishing industry about whether you can make it as an author today. And the short answer was basically disheartening. It's like, no, you're not going to sell a lot of copies, but having a book will open up doors for you and present opportunities that you wouldn't otherwise have if you hadn't written the book. But the stuff they said was just so cynical. Like one of them said, don't try to do the unique thing. You want to do the popular thing. You want to enter into the well-worn grooves. And it's true that in order to be commercially successful, yeah, you do have to do that probably. But if you want to
Yeah.
actually be remembered, think of Herman Melville, Thoreau, a lot of these people, you want to do the original thing. You got to go with where your inclination is, where the heart is, not just doing what everybody else is doing. The market is so saturated with young adult fantasy novels, and they're just mostly so terrible.
No, what do they say? I mean, if you want to make an omelet, you got to crack some eggs.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say that's the other thing. If you're going to make your name as a poet, it's good to crack a few eggs. Take some chances. Playing it safe is probably the riskiest thing that you could do.
Well, been great talking with you, Brian. Thank you for your wisdom and your advice and your expertise.
Well, thank you, Andrew. This has been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed this time together.
Till next time.
Okay, Andrew, thank you so much.
You're welcome. So that was Brian Yapko. Next time I'm going to be doing another poetry biographic in the vein of the one I did on Tasso, this time on the American epic poet John Neihardt. So stay tuned for that. I've uploaded a lot of other content. Please check out my Odyssey readings in particular, if nothing else. I've also done a reading of the prologue from my own mock epic poem, which will give you a taste of what's in my book. So until next time, stay classy and don't read insta poetry.